Well, greetings, everyone. Welcome to our evening of wines from the Northern Rhone and to a tasting of the Syrah grape. I think we may have still a few people who are waiting to join us. So while we do wait, let me just do quick introductions. As you can probably see from your screen, I'm Simon Lambert with the Chicago Wine Company. My colleague Gerard and I will be conducting the tasting between the two of us, and our relatively new colleague, Olivia Day. Welcome to our first Zoom tasting, Olivia. And Olivia,
Thank you.
Olivia is going to be the power behind the throne, pressing all the buttons, making sure things go smoothly. I'm sure they will. So we'll give just a couple more minutes. When you got the email from Olivia, just to give you the link and to list the wines, we will be tasting them in the order that she had them listed. So from the Javelais Hermitage La Chapelle to the Chapoutier Côte Rôtie Modéré, the 16 Rhone Rostaing, the 16 Guigal d'Ampuy, the 15 Corbus Cornas, and finally the 15 Delas Hermitage. So from young to old. We'll have a quick picture up there for you in a second, just to remind you of which wines are which. And as I said, I'll just give it another couple of minutes if you bear with us, and by all means start tasting, don't wait for us. We'll get this show on the road. Well, there's a picture that we all recognize, and I'm not going to steal Gerard's thunder with that one. So if you haven't seen it, I'll leave it for you to figure out where that is. Okay, so let's just start with a brief introduction about the the grape variety that is predominant in all of the wines this evening, and that's Syrah. In France, Syrah represents only about 5% of the total red wines planted throughout the country, which is quite surprising considering the reputation of the wines that we're tasting this evening. But in the Northern Rhone, it's absolutely worshipped. And as we'll see this evening, Syrah can produce wines that can, in a different way, obviously stylistically, can absolutely challenge the very finest red wines from anywhere in the world. The origin of the Syrah vine is popularly thought to be Middle Eastern, with some schools linking it to the Iranian city of Shiraz. It was brought to France by the ancient Greeks, those who lived on the Turkish side of what was then Greece, around the city of Ephesus and close to there, bringing cuttings to Marseille and then up the Rhone Valley. But there's an alternative theory that in fact it was the Roman legions who first brought the cuttings with them when they conquered Gaul. However, what is certain is that the vine was already well established in the Rhone Valley during the Roman occupation. Today, Syrah can be found around the world, most importantly, obviously, in the Northern Rhone. It is also grown in the Southern Rhone, but not so important. Australia is very important. And then, interestingly enough, after France and Australia, the next 5 countries in the world that figure in the plantings of Syrah are Argentina, this is in order, Argentina, South Africa, and then the USA, and obviously particularly in California, though we see Syrah being grown in Washington State and elsewhere too. But it's proving that at its best, when grown in a warm climate on a granite soil, such as can be found in the northern Rhone, it absolutely shines. And that's where we are focusing this evening. So without further ado, I'm going to hand this over to Gerard, who will get us going with the first wine of the evening, the Hermitage La Chapelle. Gerard, over to you.
Thanks, Simon, and welcome everybody. I know we have a bunch of those of you who have joined plenty of Zooms in the past, but I also know we have a handful of fresh faces, and we're looking forward to tasting some great wines. And it's funny to think, like, we're starting with Jablé La Chapelle. So, we're not working our way into Jablé La Chapelle. We're starting with one of the world's iconic wines, and there's so many different ways to do this, and we chose to work our way from the younger wines to the ever so slightly more mature wines. But it speaks to the caliber and pedigree of the wines that we're tasting that we get a chance to start the evening with one of the world's most iconic wines. So, excuse me. So Jablé, a 200-year winemaking history in the Rhone and one of the world's truly legendary producers. Again, the wine we're tasting tonight is one of the world's truly legendary wines. It's an iconic wine. The La Chapelle takes its name from the Chapel of St. Christopher that sits atop the hill. So Simon obviously alluded to that a little bit earlier, but it's just such a gorgeous photo. Just a very, very pretty photo. It gives you some perspective of just how imposing and towering the hill of Hermitage is. La Chapelle is a blend of primarily two vineyards on the hill of Hermitage, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into those vineyards and what makes them so special and so unique momentarily. But those two vineyards are, interestingly enough, Bessard, which is the vineyard that serves as the core of the Delas that we'll be tasting a little bit later tonight as a 100% single vineyard wine. But the Jablé La Chapelle comes primarily from Bessard and Les Mayals, which is just to the east of it, and a couple other choice plots along the hill. But the hill is so small but very, very diverse. But Bessard is the westernmost portion of the hill, pure granite, and that is what gives it its backbone. That's what gives this wine its structure and tannin. But the approachability and the kind of, I don't want to say lushness, but the very rounded nature of La Chapelle comes from the south-facing Les Mayals, which is again just to the west. So you can see in the purple, Bessard really nudges right up to the sharp turn there in the Rhone River. That is the 100% granite, whereas Les Mayals, just to the east of it there, is a little bit more limestone and clay. So the wines do get a little bit riper. It's also got a little bit more sun exposure, so that ripeness does allow the wine to be a little bit more generous. And whereas some of the other iconic Hermitages like the Chave does use fruit from across the hill, but Jablé typically, and again painting with a broad brush here, can be a little bit more approachable because of its foundation in Les Mayals and the earlier ripening portions of Les Mayals to give the wine some generosity and not make it so austere. And whereas Chave takes honestly quite a long time to really come around and be at its best, we can approach this Jablé La Chapelle tonight and get a glimpse that this wine will last for decades, of course, but the fact that we can enjoy it tonight and get a good glimpse of where it's going is really, really exciting. So again, so speaking to Hermitage, just from a broad perspective, a small but very geologically diverse appellation on the bank of the Rhone River there, you can see how it is nudged up and a very, very sharp turn on the river there. Just 150 hectares of vines overall in Hermitage, which, to give you some context, is about the size of 2 or 3, maybe 4 good-sized chateaux in Bordeaux. So wrap your head around the fact that the entire appellation of Hermitage production, very, very sparse. A good portion of Bordeaux sees considerably more production. So that kind of explains the scarcity of and the prestige of these Syrahs from Hermitage, not to mention obviously the pedigree and the incredible quality. The red wines are 100% Syrah, as we likely know. There is some, and that accounts for 70% of Hermitage's production. There is a small 30% portion that's dedicated to world-class white wines, which are utterly fantastic. And those are based around Marsanne and Roussanne. And the Marsanne and the Roussanne typically comes from, for lack of a better word, the yellowish portions on the vineyard map there. So the more easterly portions. So as you get away from the Rhone River and primarily Bessarde, which again is that purplish vineyard there that nudges up to the river there, that's pure granite. Those are going to be your powerful structured Syrah grapes. And then the majority of the Marsanne and Roussanne is grown a little bit more inland, where the soils are a little bit different and better suited for either earlier ripening Syrah or some of the Marsanne and the Roussanne. So very little single vineyard Syrah is produced from Hermitage, as most believe, Jabelet being one of them, that the best wines are a reflection of the whole appellation, the whole, of the whole hill here. In much the same way that your classic producers in Barolo feel that the best representation of Barolo isn't necessarily very, very site specific, but more a reflection of blend from across Piedmont there. But that's not to say there's a right or wrong, because obviously as we work our way towards the very end, Delas is 100% Syrah from Bessarde. Obviously you have plenty of examples elsewhere in the world. Certainly Burgundy is very, very site specific, as is Napa Valley when it comes to single plot, single block, or single vineyard wines. So it's fun to be able to taste it here in Hermitage. That is a blend of a fruit, whereas the Delas at the end of the evening will be 100% Syrah from Bessarde. Notably, Chapoutier, which we'll be tasting a Côte Rôtie from Chapoutier. Chapoutier is a big believer when it comes to Hermitage of very site-specific, he calls them his Selection Parcelles, which are the single vineyards there. He does a 3 or 4 along the hill, both with the red and the white, and those are utterly spectacular, just a totally different expression. So 3 quick key factors what makes Hermitage the styles, how to kind of figure it out. A couple things: location on the hill. I just spoke about how the west side there is going to be far more granite based, and then you get more into your clay and limestone as you work eastward. Elevation, of course, this pretty much applies everywhere you go. The higher the elevation, slightly cooler, later ripening, and the soils are typically much thinner, much more sparse, and the vines have to work a lot harder. The tannins in those wines are typically more aggressive, and these soils, of course. So again, obviously granite versus the clay and the limestone. So getting back to Jabelet very quickly, iconic vintages: 61, 78, 89, 90. These are considered some of the greatest wines ever made, not just in Hermitage, but the entire world. But in the 1990s, the winery went through a bit of a tougher stretch, and the Jabelet wines started to underperform a little bit. Some of this is due to the unexpected passing of Gerard Jabelet at just 55 years old, and the Jabelet again went through some tougher times. They lacked a little bit of leadership. There was rumors of family disputes, and frankly, a little bit of overproduction too. Too much of a good thing. At their best, the best wines are made in smaller quantities. It's hard to control production. It's hard to control quality over a much larger production, and that was kind of the course that Jabelet was going towards, or going down, in the back end of the 90s, before the Frey family purchased Jabelet in 2006. The Frey family, who was the owners of La Lagune in Bordeaux, and the leading shareholder in Villecart-Simon in Champagne. They purchased Jabelet and quickly began, that's a very pretty picture, Olivia. That's directly from the top of the hill looking downwards, so you can get a sense of just how steep those hills are. Yeah, when the Frey family purchased Jabelet, they quickly began turning the quality around, and right now they've made a commitment to really reducing the yields. The production is much smaller, back to how it used to be, and they're enjoying a string of really good vintages. Actually, that's probably an understatement. A string of great vintages, post 2010 especially. The 17 is one of the best wines they've made in many decades, as is the 15, the 18. I mean, there's really a string of really good wines. Robert Parker's on record saying that one needs to look no further at the quality of the Jabolet wines and what Carolyn Frey has been able to accomplish. And it's one of the greatest qualitative turnarounds that he's experienced in wine. So that speaks volumes to see a producer like Jabolet, who was legendary for much of the 20th century, fell on a little bit of hard times for a decade or a decade and a half, but obviously, when you're working with fruit from the Story Terroir and just you put the fruit in the hands of the right winemaking team, great things are possible. And the Jabolet 17 comes from a longer, cooler growing season in the Northern Rhone, and it sports a little bit lower alcohol, just a tick over 14% ABV. So Hermitage can get, whereas Côte Rôtie has significantly lower ABVs. The Hermitage typically plays in the high 13s to upper 14s, and this kind of falls in the lower end of the 14% spectrum. So with all of that said, let's taste one of the world's icons. And I will say, as I was smelling the wines, these are the kinds of wines that if you can't just enjoy smelling these wines, you're no friend of mine. I mean, these are just really beautifully aromatic wines, and in tasting the wines, I mean, my goodness, I had just a small little bit of this before. You can just taste the pedigree. I mean, silky smooth, despite the fact that La Chapelle does have that reputation for being, by Hermitage standards, a slightly more accessible, approachable interpretation of Hermitage. This has tannin in the backbone for sure. So even though it's a 17, this is, it's got a lot of muscle, but the class is so evident. And if this is any indication of what's to come in the next 5 wines behind us, we're in good shape. Simon, what do you think?
Lovely. I think the perception by some people of wines of the Rhone are those of Châteauneuf-du-Pape.
Yeah.
Whereas Syrah is evident in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, it's mainly Grenache, and much warmer climate, much higher alcohol in the finish in Châteauneuf. And we're looking at the Northern Rhone. I mean, there's 100-something miles between the Northern Rhone appellations and Châteauneuf. Climate in the Northern Rhone is much different. It's not as hot. There's more rain. There's much more diurnal variations in the temperature, which brings about wines that have, I love Châteauneuf, by the way, but bring about wines that have an elegance to them, and don't have the big muscular. So I think that whilst there's a lot going on here, it's not as we might think of a Rhone wine if we think Châteauneuf-du-Pape.
Sure. No, absolutely.
I have to show my age by saying that I've been lucky enough to have had 2 of the classic great La Chapelles.
I was just going to ask you,
yeah, the 67 and the 61.
My
and
goodness.
the 61, phenomenal. I mean, I haven't had it for years and years. I don't know how it's holding up, but it's a legendary wine. And then, as you quite rightly said, they went down in a bit of a doldrum, and I think have really come back strong. By the way, all of you have the ability, I think, to type in any questions or comments that you may wish to make. I don't know if we can see those or if that's just with Olivia, I'm not sure, but please feel free and we can try and answer any questions you may have. At the end of the evening, we will take a very informal poll to ask you what your favorite and probably even your second favorite wines of the entire evening were. So I think it's going to be a hard decision to make, but nonetheless, go for it.
Simon, when did you have that iconic vintage of La Chapelle? When? How long ago was that?
Oh my goodness! Well, it's got to be probably close to 50 years ago, I would think.
Oh goodness, yeah.
I mean, a long time, Young wine back then.
No, I think this is a great start to the evening. And like I said, I mean, there's so many different ways we could have sliced it, kind of working from younger to slightly more mature or backwards. But this was a great way to start. But I will say that as I was just kind of taking a quick sniff of each wine, actually the Chapoutier was to me the most aromatically explosive of the six. So this is one that I'm looking forward to hearing about and tasting through. So why don't you work our way to Chapoutier here?
Okay, so Côte Rôtie. The River Rhone, on the pictures that we saw running past the hill at Hermitage, is running from the top of the picture down to the bottom, so from north to south, because Hermitage is on the east bank of the river. If we travel in the opposite flow from the river itself, 30 miles north of Hermitage, which, by the way, on some proprietors' labels, they drop the H and call it Hermitage, which I believe was the old spelling. And then they added the H. So either way, it's the same wine from the same appellation. So 30 miles north of Hermitage, on the east bank, on the west bank of the Rhone, is Côte Rôtie, the roasted coast, the roasted slopes. And it's here that you find wines that are tend to be fuller bodied, a little more aromatic than Hermitage initially, and I'll explain that in just a moment. Côte Rôtie is interesting, and in fact, most of the Rhones for that matter. I was looking back just the other day when we were preparing for this. I still have a price list from Avery's of Bristol, which was the first wine merchant that I joined, and the price list was dated 1969. And big Rhones, a big Bordeaux section, big Burgundy section, and the Rhone section, they had a Châteauneuf-du-Pape, a Côte de Rhone, and a Hermitage. No producer name, because they put their own labels on it back then, and that was it. When I did my Wine and Spirits Education Trust courses, again, some years ago now, Rhone was being featured, but it wasn't anything like the way it is today. So a little bit of history. Côte Rôtie actually was at its peak initially in about the late 1800s. But then phylloxera and mildew and mold all devastated the vineyards. And the economy down in that part of France was so poor that the farmers just had no resilience whatsoever, and basically gave up growing vines. And in fact, by 1945, a pound of grapes from Côte Rôtie cost about half as much as a pound of apricots or apricots. And so there were a lot of fruit plantation back then, orchards and the like, and very little in the way of wine production. I mean, we now have to move forward to about 1975, when the economy started to pick up a bit, and there was much more interest in the wines of the Northern Rhone, and replanting begun. And by 1980, there in fact had been a renaissance, thanks to a very large extent by Guigal, whose wines we will, or wine we will experience and enjoy a little bit later. It was a lot of small farmers back then, but Guigal had the ability to promote the wines of Côte Rôtie and to introduce the world to really, really top quality Côte Rôtie. And then other producers followed or became more, consumers became more aware of them. So Côte Rôtie itself, as you can see on the little map there, if you can see the contour lines, they're very, very close together. It's an extremely steep, terraced vineyards. The vines themselves, maybe even only 1 or 2 rows per terrace, that are held up by mortarless brick walls, some of which were put in place initially by the Romans themselves when they were planting. The aspect of the vines, for the most part, are either south-facing, or the vineyards are either south-facing or southeast-facing, some of which so steep that it's about 60% incline. I mean, it's that steep. and some of the vineyards have pulley systems in place with a big winch at the top. And as they pick the grapes and they go up the slope with the grapes, they put the grapes into the tubs and they get, oh, sorry, other way around. They come down the slope, obviously. They pick from the top and then come down. And the baskets or the tubs come down with them on these ropes and almost rails, like they do in parts of the Mosel in Germany as well. Moderate rainfall as we mentioned earlier, in the northern Rhone. Dry southerly wind that dries out the soil, so extra advantage for draining, and as is so important for Syrah, the granite soils. Of the two main portions of Côte-Rôtie, you can see the two circled names there, Côte Brune, slightly to the north of Côte Blonde. And the story goes that one of the seigneurs or knights or landowners back in the day had two daughters, one who had blonde hair and one who had brunette hair. And he owned the land, and that's how those got the name. There's also, I think probably more truthful, is that the Côte Blonde has a slightly lighter soil than Côte Brune does. Côte Brune is a little heavier. Extremely steep. I think we may have a photo of some of the vineyards in Côte-Rôtie, but we can get to that later when I come back to Côte-Rôtie anyway. No, maybe not yet. That's all right. So, Chapoutier, big company, established in 1897 as basically as a negociant, so a trader in wines, buying other people's grapes and wines and selling them under their name, and then also a producer of their own grapes and their own vines to a certain extent. But in 1990, it was an absolute watershed moment for Chapoutier when young Michel Chapoutier was appointed as the man in charge. And he took over and really was remarkable in what he did in the vineyards and the wines that Chapoutier produced in Côte-Rôtie and the Northern Rhone in general. He introduced single vineyard wines, showcasing unique terroirs, and even, as you may have seen on some of his labels, put Braille on the label for the visually impaired, which is, I don't think I've ever seen anybody else doing that. An unwavering commitment to perfection, biodynamic, organic, no chemicals, no pesticides, and pruning and harvesting are all guided by cycles of the moon, the sun, and the earth. Chapoutier's single vineyard wines, of which there are a number, have over the years received more 100-point scores than any other producer anywhere in the world. The wine this evening is actually not a single vineyard wine. It is a branded name, La Modérée, and comes from two plots, one in the Côte Brune and one in the Côte Blonde. Confusingly, for some people, there is actually a vineyard also called Côte Brune within the Côte Brune, but these are sites within the Côte Brune and the Côte Blonde. I don't know the percentages. I tried to do some research on that. Nothing was relevant to me. The wines, all his wines, and this included destemmed and vinified in concrete tanks with a daily pump over to draw more color out of it. Only free run juice is used, no pressing at all. The wine's aged in 25-liter or 60-gallon oak casks, with a portion being new for between 14 and 18 months. Now, remember those points when we get to Guigal's Côte-Rôtie, because it will be interesting on a comparison. The wine laws in Hermitage say that it has to be 100% Syrah. The wine laws in Côte-Rôtie say that they can use up to 10% of the white grape variety of Viognier. Most don't use anywhere near that amount. Some don't use any. It's my understanding that this is 100% Syrah in this particular instance. The Guigal wine will have some Viognier in it. And again, we can discuss that when we get to it. Gerard's already spoken about the vintage itself, 17. But you can really, when you compare the two wines, it's absolutely fascinating. The Côte-Rôtie, same grapes, 30 miles apart, slightly different exposure, but very aromatic. Almost, I almost pick up some flowers on the nose as well, floral notes, which you might not expect. I think this and the Hermitage, they're young. I mean, these wines could go for 20, 30 years without any problem at all and be magnificent. Oh, there's almost a silkiness, a velvetiness quality to that. The tannins are apparent, but interesting, I think that the tannins are more apparent in the Hermitage, which you would expect, given the style of the wine from Côte Rôtie. Very full-bodied, rounded, sensational style of wine. I didn't make a note of the alcohol, but I've got the bottle behind me, so I can tell you what it might say. 14%, and that's on the label, so no, give or take a percentage or so. Really nice. Gerard, what do you think?
I think it speaks to just the acumen of Chapoutier. Just, you know, he just these caliber of winemakers just truly do understand. I mean, while he's built his empire around, at least at the top end. I mean, obviously Chapoutier makes quite a bit of wines at the, that aren't quite as prestigious as the La Mordoret Côte Rôtie or the single vineyard Hermitages. But just having the ability to understand that when and why single vineyard wines can work and be great expressions of Hermitage or any single vineyard of a given appellation. Whereas in this case, so I guess what I'm saying is, Chapoutier you go to Hermitage and he is just very, very site specific, down to a T. Like he wants it to taste exactly like, Layer Meat or Les Mial, whereas this being a blend speaks to, he knows, the best winemakers understand when it is appropriate to, express an appellation or a vineyard or a climat, as a whole, as a collective, or when it could be more site specific. And this being a blend of two great vineyards, this is super well done. And this is very, very impressive. And like I said, I was excited. This is one of those wines where the aromatics, the quality of the aromatics transfer right to the palate. It's not a wine that smells better than it's a wine that smells fantastic and just tastes beautiful. And to your point, like you said, it's a silky wine, has a lot of floral component to it. There's still the Rhone. There's still a little bit of there is a little bit of a meatiness to it. There is a little bit of I almost got a little bit of like a bacony or sausage kind of component, which to me I find so often in the Northern Rhone, and that's why I love these expressions of Syrah. But this is a great wine. Got a lot of backbone, like you said. This wine's going to go for a while. I think it speaks a little bit, obviously, to the northern Côte Rôtie being more northerly than anybody else in the Northern Rhone, or the Rhone for that matter. And the vintage, just being a little bit of a cooler vintage. So the longer growing seasons, the wines didn't achieve, considerable ripeness. Not that these wines are typically lower alcohol wines and more lifted and lighter styled wines anyway. But the vintage especially lends itself to a wine that is, has some tannin behind it for sure, but is offering quite a bit right now. Absolutely.
Jim is asking us, where does La Mordoret come from, the meaning? It's a poetic name for the woodcock, a game bird that is known throughout that part of France and elsewhere. And I think, I'm not sure why they chose to call it woodcock or La Mordoret. Maybe the color of the feathers, the brownish color of the feathers reminds them of the color of the soil. It's certainly not clear to me. And in fact, there are other properties that use in the Rhone that use Mordoret as well. So it's a fairly popular name. Any other questions? Let's see.
I don't recall now. Olivia, do you know if you could hop back in? Do we have the ability? Do we have individual polls, Simon? Do we have individual polls, so to speak, for the flight, within the flight, or are we just kind of taking some feedback or a little poll at the very end of the night?
I'm not sure. I think it may be just a poll at the end, but if anybody has a preference on the two and would like to just type it into the Q&A box, we can certainly see, I hope.
We are doing a poll at the end, and everyone should have the ability to chat with all of us and then also ask questions as well.
And that's in the taskbar at the bottom of the screen, I think.
Yes, mine is at the top.
Oh, okay. It's there somewhere. Enjoyed the Chapoutier better. Yeah, different style of wine. I mean, let's be honest. I think Jeb Dunnock's comment or his review on the Chapoutier sums it up best in that last sentence. He says it has the opulence to drink well now, and I think opulence is the word. I think the La Chapelle is wonderfully complex, but there's an opulence, velvety quality to the Côte Rôtie.
I think that's it's fairly typical. Chapoutier has a reputation for making some flashier wines, but never at the expense of compromising the terroir he's working with, or kind of overshadowing the vineyards, and it's just a good balance of just great winemaking, but clearly you can taste like this immediately, this wine takes you on the nose, like this takes you to the Rhone, and stylistically, especially when you compare it to this is actually a good way to, I'm glad that we started this way with these two wines from the two different appellations. You can get a feel exactly for what stylistically what Hermitage is like compared to Côte Rôtie.
Yeah.
Not one better than the other, of course. I mean, they're both world-class appellations, but just stylistically different, even though it's Syrah, like you said, separated by a grand total of 30 miles.
I think if you have the strength of mind to save some of the first wine, put it to one side and wait till we get to the last wine of the evening, which is also from the same appellation. Obviously, a couple of years difference in age, but it will be interesting to compare two Hermitages side by side.
And I think that's right, Jim. I think that's exactly it. So this is always fun because, again, right now we're taking the peek at wines that are still, all things considered, just babies, so young. But in both of these wines early on gave us a glimpse. But I think that the Chapoutier is a wine that I would love to drink over and over and over the course of tonight and the coming years and many years to come. I think the La Chapelle is still holding quite a bit back, and it's going to be an awesome wine. But I think, at least for my palate, I think the Chapoutier is just singing really, really nice right now. Yeah. So with that, I will I will keep us in Côte Rôtie and transition us to the 2016 Rhone Rostaing Côte Blonde. And Simon gave us a great foundation for Côte Rôtie, and I will just expand on that a little bit, give us a little bit more context. And as we had mentioned, Côte Rôtie is the northernmost portion of the Northern Rhone. So that is where a lot of people feel, and John Livingstone Learmonth, who is a legendary author of many Rhone books and just very, very well regarded in the Rhone, he considers it the bridge between Burgundy and the Rhone. Understandably, there's a lot of people who feel that these wines can have very ethereal qualities to them. The Syrah is much different than it is in Hermitage, certainly much different than it is in California for that matter, or Australia or elsewhere in the world. But there's something to be said for the Côte Rôtie being almost as close to Burgundy, having more similarities or equal similarities to Burgundy, as it be more similar to Burgundy than it would certainly in the southern portion of the Northern Rhone, or even the south, of the southern Rhone for that matter. But as Simon said, even though Hermitage might be the more famous, and put that in air quotes, of the two appellations, Côte Rôtie has the ability to capture to world-class styles. I mean, the power and opulence of the South, and then the delicacy and nuance of the North, and especially with the aromatic. So Simon already mentioned just what makes these vineyards so unique, and the fact that many of them are at 60-degree angles and just very, very difficult to farm, which speaks to there's a lot of labor. These wines are a labor of love. It's tough to farm these vineyards. These take dedication, and even though, like Simon said, I mean, in its heyday, Côte Rôtie, a generation ago, but in the 1950s, Côte Rôtie was almost non-existent. To think that only about 15 or 20% of Côte Rôtie even had grapevines. You know, in 2023, it is a burgeoning, flourishing appellation. But less than 75 years ago, only 20% of Côte Rôtie had grapevines. But again, that speaks to the challenge of growing the grapes here. A lot of the families had abandoned them. The local families had abandoned the vineyards, and they were growing vegetables and fruits instead. Like Simon said, they went to work in the nearby factories. So to think, what the potential that the appellation has already had, but it has always had, but it's overcome, considerable challenges, and it's finally over the last 20, 30, 40 years, received the recognition that it has deserved. And that's for a couple reasons. And Simon touched on especially Guigal and the efforts of Guigal to bring this appellation back to prominence. But there were other things. There were growers organizations led by an iconic name in the Rhone, Albert Derview. The commercial success of the 76 vintage was a great vintage in the Northern Rhone. Just some development within the Rhone. There were new roads paved to get up the slopes and making it a little bit easier to access the vineyards, making it easier both for the locals and also for those, tending these vines. Piggybacking the influence that Guigal had was the fact that Robert Parker championed these wines as well. In the same way that he, was very bullish on certain vintages in the 80s in Bordeaux, he was equally bullish about the prospects and the potential that Côte Rôtie has always had. It wasn't like this was an appellation that came out of nowhere. It was simply an appellation that has always held potential. Went through some tougher times in the middle of the 20th century, but in between, and not only that 76 harvest, but some greater harvests in the 80s and the 90s really brought it to more prominence and allow us to enjoy the wines that we have here today. The classic, at its best, Côte Rôtie is from a stylistically, the wines are considerably lower in alcohol, and you'd kind of expect that. The climate is much cooler. The fact that it is so far north in the Rhone, these wines typically play in the more 12% to 13%, maybe 13.5% alcohol by volume, portion of the spectrum. Some of that is attributed to, again, the Viognier, that is the white grape that is blended into a lot of the Côte Rôties for aromatics, always co-fermented, so never fermented separately. The allowable, it can be as much as 20% Viognier. The wines have to be a minimum of 80% Syrah and can be as much as 20% Viognier, but that is almost never happens. I want to say maybe one of the Lalas, I believe it's La Moulin, has a considerable splash of Viognier, maybe 9, 10, 11%, but that is considered quite a bit. Usually they'll see 2, 3, 4%. But it's fascinating how much influence the Viognier has or what it can add to the aromatics, just having a couple percent inclusion into that blend with the Syrah. So you're blending just a couple percent of white grapes to give it that aromatic floral lift and let the Syrah kind of carry it home. So Rostaing, the estate dates back to 1971 when René Rostaing began tending a small number of plots in his family's vineyards, but he did have the perfect role model to guide him into a now legendary winemaking career. And that was Marius Gentes, his uncle, another one of the Rhone's iconic names. So, in addition to working the vineyards with his uncle, he also, at that time, kind of going back to how little demand. It's crazy to think how little demand there was for those vineyards and what they were able to be acquired for monetarily. To think that he was able to acquire at that time just starting out, a small parcel in the Cote Blonde, and he actually had the ability to get a small piece of La Landon as well, which is crazy to think that it was there for the taking. Now, obviously, his family connections helped, but just a relatively small investment in two of the La Landon being one of the true icon vineyards of the world and one of the basis for one of the iconic Guigal Côte Rôtis. And he also, through marriage, had another great role model in Albert Derview, who also played a significant role. And these two men, Gentaz and Derview, when they moved on and retired, that is really what allowed Rostang to take what was just a couple small plots. He inherited some vineyards from family, and that's what allowed him to grow his business into one of the biggest names in the Rhone from some of the oldest vineyards. So, even though it was a bit of good fortune, it's great winemaking, and just again, just kind of right place, right time, in the sense of just through family connections, picking up some great plots that have allowed him to now make 3 Côte Rôtis. He'll make the wine we're trying tonight, which is the Cote Blonde. He'll make a small, very small production from Côte Brune in select vintages, as well as a small piece of La Landon. So as much as people think that Guigal, the La Landon, is a monopole, so to speak, or just kind of wholly owned by Guigal, that is not the case. A small little bit goes to Rostang. Actually, a small little bit in select vintages goes to Delas, and as well as Bernard Levay. So there are some other producers making expressions of La Landon, not just Guigal. And the Rostang La Landon is a fantastic wine. It's actually one of the wines that got me really interested in the Northern Rhone. In a nice way, it's not priced quite to the levels of Guigal's, and it doesn't have quite the same prestige, but it is an utterly spectacular wine, and it speaks to Rostang's very traditional winemaking, as does the Cote Blonde that we're having here today. The Cote Blonde, Olivia, if you could throw back up the Côte Rôti map, if you could. And as you can see, so the town of Dampuy and the site of the Chateau d'Ampuy that we'll work our way into, the Cote Blonde, is just up the hill. So it's just literally above the hill of the town of Ampuy. And as Simon mentioned, the Cote Blonde versus the Cote Brune wines typically take considerably longer to come around, far more muscular wines. The Cote Blonde is built on a little bit more elegance and finesse, but the wine itself, it just in a very simplistic way, it just tastes like the essence of the Northern Rhone. I just think it's a stunning wine. These are really nice wines. This has, to me, it has a little bit more muscle than the Chapoutier, and that is a little bit of a byproduct of two things. The vineyard, this vineyard does lend itself to a little bit riper fruit, and also the vintage. 17 being the cooler vintage, 16 being another really good vintage in the Northern Rhone. All three vintages that we're tasting today, 15, 16, 17, these are excellent vintages, 15 being the best, but all three of these vintages are really solid. But this is a good expression, or this is a good opportunity to taste wines from different producers, different sites within Côte Rôti across a couple of vintages. Simon, what are your thoughts? I think this is, it's one of those wines that I don't want to say leaves me speechless, but it's tough. There's a lot going on here, but there's also, quite a bit of muscle to it too.
Yeah, this needs time. I mean, there's so much going on here, but it is still, I don't want to say aggressive, because that's not the way I want it to come across, but it's certainly very quite tight at the moment, and tannic on the palate. Yeah. But there's so much lying underneath that. that initial impact of the tannins. Great length, lovely finish, goes on and on. Let me just, yeah, put that one away for a few years.
Yeah, but it's one of the wines where, you know, there are times when wines can be just so tannic and so assertive that they don't give you anything. You know, they're just very unyielding. They're frankly unenjoyable to drink. They almost need food, obviously time. But this is one where the tannins are present for sure. They're there. You know, the wine is going to, you know, meld into something that's really nice. But it's one of those wines, just like a good young Bordeaux. You know that the tannins are there. You know the potential is there. You know the structure is there. But it gives you, you know, it gives you a lot of different nuances, and it shows a lot of character. Maybe not at, you know, the volume's obviously not turned up to 10 on all of them, but it's giving you, you know, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. This is interesting. Each time you go back to the glass, it's something different. Obviously 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, it'll be significantly more prominent and easily identifiable, but there's a lot going on even right now.
I think your analogy of a young Bordeaux is perfect, because everything is there. It's just still now in its infancy, and the tannins that are really elegant, refined tannins that will integrate into the fruit and the ripeness of the wine as the wine ages. I would think this will be a stellar wine given some bottle age.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. And Rostang is not a name that's well known. I mean, small production, but for those people in the know who know the wines of the Northern Rhone, Rostang is one of the wines that or one of the producers that they seek out invariably whenever they can.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's the fact that so much of the Rhone is you know, your big names, your Chapoutiers, your Pigaults, your Javelets, your Delas. I mean, understandably, those these producers make excellent wines. But if you do a little homework, and like you said, those in the know Rostang. I mean, I'm glad that you know. I wish I would have known about Rostang much earlier in my wine evolution. But I had a good friend who kind of tipped me off to Rostang, you know, quite a while ago, and these are the wines that I just really enjoy drinking. And again, I mean, there's always going to be, these are smaller appellations. There's a premium place on its best wines from a price perspective. I mean, but from you know, broadly speaking, you know, compared to other world-class regions, the Northern Rhone still remains relatively, I mean, the wines are attainable. To be able to get world-class this isn't Burgundy in the sense of, you know, these wines are out there. I mean, there's Grand Cru caliber wines that, you know, that aren't all that much above $100, and you know, certainly if you play in that 150, 200, 250 range, there is first growth Grand Cru caliber wines from the Northern Rhone that are still you know, within reach, which I think is, you know, great.
Yeah. What would you, Gerard, think as an ideal maturity for a wine like this? How many years would you want to put it down for? 10?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that I think so. Because there's one of the biggest, I mean, of course, there's plenty of Bordeaux that just tells you that the second you drink it too young, it just waves a finger and it says, I'm not ready yet. But one of the biggest misconceptions is that all wines need to go away, you know, for a decade or 15 years. And you're not going to go wrong in doing that, you know, but you miss out on the enjoyment of the just kind of that juxtaposition of the fruit, you know, the exuberance of the fruit, and some of those, you know, other characteristics that there's something to be said for just enjoying wine not too young. You know, obviously you don't want to, not encouraging us or anybody for that matter to just crack into a 6-pack on release and drink the wines, but to your point, or to your suggestion, yeah, I think that 10 years is a great. There's so many really spectacular northern Rhones from 9, 10, 12, and 13 right now. The 13 is, I mean, they're 12. I mean, there's been some really, really good. 13 is a little tricky vintage, but 9, 10, and 12 especially had a utterly spectacular bottle. Interestingly enough, as we'll pass it back to you for the Guigal Chateau d'Ampuis Côte Rôtie, not too long ago, 2012, Guigal d'Ampuis was utterly fantastic. And speaking back to this Rostang, yes, I think that's right as far as 8 to 10 to 12 years where you can really kind of open them as you please. There's never going to be a right or a wrong. I think that's one of the old adages outside of some Bordeaux, that I think that you can get away with opening some of these lines at a decade and there's never a right or wrong. But I think this one is going to be really, really good in about 5 or 6 more years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think just in the 5 minutes or so that we've had this in the glass and been tasting and talking about it, it's blossomed so much and opened up so much just in that short period of time. Imagine if, for those of you who we opened these and decanted these samples, and you can see from the bottles that you received, they're filled right to the top. So there was, and this was done very quickly. So there's little or no exposure to air. And so you're basically opening these sample bottles as though you were opening and pulling the cork on a regular full bottle. And you can see just in this brief period of time that we've been talking about the wine and having it poured in front of us, how it's starting to blossom. Yeah. Again, if you have enough glasses and you're not in a hurry, come back to it in an hour or so, or come back to it tomorrow, because I wouldn't be in the least bit surprised. Yeah. Fine. Have it for breakfast tomorrow with some corned beef hash. So, any comments, any thoughts, anybody on the Rostang? You're welcome to chime in if you wish. Otherwise, we'll move on. We'll move on to Guigal's 2016 Chateau d'Ampuis. Olivia, by the way, did we have a photo showing Côte Rôtie as the slopes in the vineyards? I'm not sure if we did or not. I don't remember.
I don't believe we did.
No, okay, that's all right. So, over the last half century or so, Guigal has been. Oh, okay, yeah, we'll get there in a moment. So there's a picture there which will give you some idea. Guigal has been a measuring stick for quality and typicity in the Rhone Valley, not just in Côte Rôtie, although that's where they are based, but certainly further south and now even down in Châteauneuf-du-Pape, where they have recently purchased an estate. The property was originally founded in 1946 by Etienne Guigal, who, interestingly enough, had worked prior to that for the firm of, help me, two word, you mentioned it.
Vidal-Fleury.
Vidal-Fleury, thank you. Yes. So he was the head winemaker, the cellar master at Vidal-Fleury. Broke away from Vidal-Fleury, set up his own business in 1946, and full circle, just in the last few years, Guigal bought Vidal-Fleury. So it's back where it probably belonged, and they're making different wines there, by the way, under Vidal-Fleury label, not under Guigal label, and they're not trying to incorporate Vidal-Fleury wines into Guigal. It's a totally separate property. So after he bought the property, it expanded, and they started buying vineyards around and in the slopes above the town of Ampuis, which is what we saw on the map that we had earlier. Though, despite its fame today, Guigal owns probably no more than 150 acres in the northern Rhone. of which their most revered and most famous vineyard plots are the three so-called Lalas, La Landon, La Moline, and La Turque. And it was in the 1978 and then through the 80s that they introduced these three single vineyard wines, which absolutely put them on the map as one of the great wine makers or wine houses in the world, and redefine the standard for many people of Côte Rôtie, particularly with all the 100 points that were being given out to them at the time. In recent years, however, there's another wine that's been added to the Guigal stable. And as you can see from the photograph on the screen, the property there is Chateau d'Ampuis, which was in a very run-down condition when Guigal purchased it in 1995. And they spent a great deal of money and 11 years renovating the property to where it is today. And it is now the headquarters of the Guigal company. Just off and to the bottom of the photograph that you see there, you see the little turret on the right. Just below that wall is the River Rhone. So it's right on the banks of the River Rhone. And behind the chateau, you can see some of the hills rising up above that form part of Côte Rôtie. So you can get a fairly good idea of how steep some of those vineyards are. I would recommend, when you have a moment, go to Guigal's website. They have some fantastic photographs, some great aerial videos showing the vineyards in general. I didn't put them up tonight because it's just too long and will take too much time. However, Guigal does have one little clip which I'd like to show you, if we can get to that now, please, Olivia. It starts with an overview of France as a country, and you'll see at the bottom Marseille and the Rhone River. And we have to crank up the machine here. Pedal faster, Olivia. Okay, you know what? If it doesn't come up, don't worry about it. It's okay. But the videos on the Guigal website, and you can look at it there, and you can see as it zooms in to the southern Rhone, then up past Châteauneuf-du-Pape, up past Hermitage, and then Saint-Joseph and Condrieu, and on up to Côte Rôtie, and then zooms right in to the hills of Côte Rôtie, and you can see quite clearly in that video how intense the steepness of the vineyards are. Chateau d'Ampuis, as I said, was a property that they reestablished, that they rebuilt, and became their headquarters. And during that renovation, they discovered that in the records there was a wine that had been made at the chateau from vineyards owned by the chateau that was called Chateau d'Ampuis. And so they decided that they wanted to produce a wine that would recognize the history behind Chateau d'Ampuis and at the same time show their devotion to the wines of Côte Rôtie. Chateau d'Ampuis is a wine that's made from 7 different vineyards in Côte Rôtie, 3 of which are in the Côte Blonde, and the others are in the Côte Brune, each of which sit adjacent to some of their famous vineyards like La Moline and La Turque and La Landon. It's a blend of Syrah, about 70%, I think. Sorry, got my note here. No, much higher than that, sorry. 93% Syrah and 7% Viognier. So here we have not a high percentage of Viognier, given what's allowed, but a percentage that, as Gerard said, co-fermented with the reds, that gives it a lift and an aromatic quality that is very typical. If you've ever tasted, I'm sure most of you have, Viognier from Condrieu or somewhere else on its own, the white wine, very aromatic style of wine that adds these aromatics to the red. Yeah, I mean, there's a lovely floral aromat, almost grapey in a good way.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting. I wonder if we tasted this totally blind in the dark and didn't see the color, whether on the nose alone we would think it was a red wine. I'm not sure. It's a fascinating fascinating exercise. So I mentioned to you earlier that the Chapoutier wines, the Chapoutier Côte Rôtie, excuse me, was aged in oak casks with a portion being new, only a portion, for 14 to 18 months. Guigal's Ampuis is handled in exactly the same way as they handle the Lalats, the Lalandon, Lamelian, and La Turque. 100% new oak, every vintage, and 40 months in those casks. I mean, that's extraordinary. You'd think that you'd be getting nothing but oak on the nose and on the palate and nothing else. But yes, it's a little bit oaky compared to the Rostang, understandably, all that new oak. But there's still loads of fruit coming through. I think it's a testament to the quality of the winemaking and the knowledge and the skill at Guigal that they can handle a wine like this and not kill it with the oak. I think I mentioned in one of our Zoom tastings some time back now, I once had a conversation with a barrel maker in France, and one comment that he was thrilled that the top chateaus were buying his barrels and paying a lot of money for them. And he said, but the one thing, when I taste the wines that use my barrels, I don't want to taste my oak in their barrels. I want my oak to be part of it, to be just a seamless flow of fruit and aromatics, which include the oak. And I think Guigal has done a great job doing that here.
Well, I think that just hopping in, I mean, not to paint an odd comparison, but this, to your point, speaks to, this is just a very judicious use of oak from a great winemaking team. In much the same way that, you know, the answer to a Chardonnay that's too oaky is not no oak. The answer to a Chardonnay that's too oaky is proper use of oak. You know, dialing it back so that the oak doesn't overpower the wine and blends together and adds complexity, nuance, and creates a better wine. In much the same way here, you know, I mean, the oak almost gives it I mean, everything that you mentioned. I mean, it's very, and that's bingo. Jose is that's exactly it. I get a little hint, but not intrusive amount of vanilla-ish kind of quality from the oak. But to me, it makes the wine more interesting. It makes it it adds a bit of in a good way. Almost sounds like a pejorative, a little bit of a creaminess, a little bit of a rounder kind of mouthfeel. But everything else is still there. So you're still tasting Côte Rôtie, but that, and especially when that oak does eventually fully integrate, because at the end of the day, we're tasting in 2016, which is still very young. When that oak goes away, you're still going to have a silky, smooth wine. And just knowing that this is actually one of my, I can't recommend this wine enough from some of the older vintages. I mean, 3 is a bottle, 2003 is a bottle that I've had a handful of times over the last 2 or 3 years. And it just, for a vintage in the Rhone that has the reputation for being very ripe and just very heavy, that wine is absolutely spectacular right now. 9 and 10 big vintages in the Rhone that are going to be much better, but a really, really good wine. I had a 10 not too long ago that was fantastic. This should be another one. And this is, I just think that in much the same way that, you know, Chapoutier has really dialed into what works with his single vineyards and his approach. I mean, Guigal, there's no way around it. Guigal never, they don't, you know, shy away from it. They lean into the fact that they incorporate, you know, like quite a bit of oak into their wines, not to make the wines oaky, but to bring an element to the wine that just really, really complements everything else that's going on in it. And this is, it's a sexy wine. It's a very, very sexy, interesting, complex, you know, very, very singular expression of Côte Rôtie. I think it's beautiful.
Yeah, yeah. Olivia, if we could just move on with the slides. I think there's another map of Côte Rôtie, not the colored one. There was another one. So there's Château d'Ampuis. Yeah, move on to the next one if you can find it, please. Oh, keep going. We'll come back to that in a second. Keep going. Have we lost it? Nah, no. Oh, that's Hermitage. No, we'll just stop for a sec. Okay, so, oops. No, don't leave yet. Thank you for joining us.
Stick around. Stick around.
Going back quickly to Gerard talking about, no. Okay, never mind. We'll skip the maps. That's okay. So how? Okay, question. Actually, Gerard, you may want to answer this. Jim is asking, how does a lieu dit compare to a vineyard in Napa?
Same concept. I mean,
yeah.
lieu dit is literally, and I'm not going to purport to speak French by any stretch, but basically lieu dit loosely translates to, you know, named vineyard. So it recognizes a specific site in much the same way that a single vineyard in Napa. So I mean, for all intents and purposes, you can look at it as a single vineyard wine. So if you're talking about Tokalan, or you're talking about, you know, I mean, there's, you know, Dr. Crane, I mean, in Napa, same kind of concept. So there are, I mean, that is more or less directly transferable to France or to the Northern Rhone, in the same way that, you know, kind of think of it as, you know, a single vineyard wine in France, very similar to a Louis D, like you said, Jim, as well as a specific cru in Burgundy, same way as in Barolo as well. So yeah. Same kind of concept.
You won't see it in Bordeaux, because Bordeaux doesn't have per se single vineyard wines. There are some Bordeaux properties that have contiguous vineyards and only, but for the most part they're rather parcellated more than now we're looking at the lieu dits. Yeah, so the name of the vineyard. So as Gerard just mentioned, I mean, Burgundy, good example. Bordeaux, good example. Excuse me, Rhone, good example. Anybody got any thoughts on these two wines? Likes and dislikes, or I don't want to say which of these two is your favorite, because they're so strikingly different.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's probably it's not unfair to taste them side by side, because I think that's a really good opportunity to compare two totally different styles of winemaking in the same appellation. But it's for me, I think that the Guigal is clearly more approachable now, and probably more appealing immediately. Whereas I think the Rostand probably has a longer life to it.
Yeah, I would agree. I think there's, I mean, a matter of subjectivity, you know, as to preference. I mean, there's no right or wrong. I mean, the Guigal is, I love that wine, but the Rostand just says, hey, I'm a little bit more serious. Not better, just a little bit more serious. Yeah.
So just to finish up on Guigal, just in passing, hot off the press, I think a week or so ago, Guigal now has, or will have on the market, not yet, another Lala. In the 2022 vintage, Guigal will have an additional Lala wine. I'm reading this because it's not that familiar with me yet. Guigal La Reynard is produced from 100% Syrah that comes from vines planted in the Fongion lieu dit, which is a little bit further back from, you can't see it on that map exactly, but you see the circle where Côte Brune is. It's up towards the top of that circle more. It's still steep, intensely steep vineyards, not flatland at all. And it's named after a small stream that is between Côte Brune and Côte Blonde. So it's, yeah. No, I can't see it quite. What can I tell you about it? Planted in 2015. It's for the foreseeable future, the fruit will be used for time being. La Renard will be made from young vines. But keep in mind that 1985 La Turque was produced from 5-year-old vines. And the debut of La London in 1978 came from 3-year-old vines. That's quite remarkable. I wouldn't expect anybody to debut a wine of that stature with a 3-year-old wine. So that's one to watch out for, I think. La Renard from Guigal, another one, a fourth Lala. So we're going to move on. I need to pour myself some wine. So give me a second here. And we're going to go back down south, past Hermitage, about 10 miles south of Hermitage, to on the opposite side of the river, so on the west bank of the Rhone, to the appellation of Cornas. When I first started in the wine business, and for many years after that, Cornas was considered to be nothing more than a rustic wine. Yes, it had the same grapes, it had Syrah, as did the much more highly regarded wines across the river in Hermitage and up north in Côte-Rôtie. But it was never up to the same standards as either of those two much more renowned appellations. The vineyards of Cornas, for the most part, are probably almost a mirror image of those of Hermitage. Steep, terraced, granite vineyards leading down to the river. That as modern winemaking techniques and viticulture expanded and grew and became something that was more available and was being learned by many of the vineyard owners in Cornas, so the quality of their wines started to improve. In doing so, many of the big names, the well-known names in the Rhone, had bought or already owned some vineyards in Cornas and produced wines like that. So you think of Cornas as being almost a wine that none of us have ever heard of before, is now just coming to the fore. However, tonight's wine from Domaine Corbis, the family that owned the property, they had vineyard holdings in that site or in that area from I think about the 1600s. So it's certainly not a relatively new 1700s, maybe give or take 100 years. It's not new from that perspective, but it was only in the 1990s that the brothers Laurent and Dominique took over the properties from their father, and they have properties both in Cornas and further north in Saint-Joseph. But Cornas, as you can see at the picture on the left, again, steep terraced vineyards, not quite as steep as Côte-Rôtie, but on the right you can see it dipping away a little bit higher up and away from the river, but nonetheless, this south and southeast exposures, similar sort of exposure to Côte-Rôtie, and 100% Syrah, which is the law in Cornas, with today aromatic concentrated wines of great purity and without ever losing their sense of place. Very different from Hermitage from that point of view, but nonetheless now wines that I think are or should be considered very seriously to anyone who is a lover of Northern Rhone wines. So much so that this wine, the 2015 Les Gars, was a 100-point wine when it was reviewed. So I think the ruggedness has dropped away from most Cornas, not all. There's still some that push it a bit and don't do as good a job. But Corbis, Laser Gap Vineyard is small. It's only about 3.5 acres, and 25-year-old vines that average production on these steep granite-laden hills of somewhere in the region of 5,000 bottles a year. So small production, old vines, everything you want. Old vines, granite soils, terraced vineyards, south and southeast exposure, and small production. I think this is for many of you, this may be an introduction to Cornas for the first time. Deep color, as indeed most of these are, but now we're looking at a 15, so it's got some bottle age. Yeah, there's blackberries on the nose. I always associate with Syrah, and many people do, crushed black pepper. I'm not sure I get that much of it on here, but there is some going on, I think, and smell of leather. Mm. Ooh, that's a mouthful.
Yeah.
There's some sweetness, there's some acidity which lightens it up. This is not a heavy, clumsy, rustic wine at all.
No.
Yeah, Gerard, what do you think?
Yeah, I think to me, it's a little bit it plays in the same ballpark as the Gigal in that it has, there's their richness for sure. It's got, the fruit is undeniable, but as soon as that fruit goes away, it's like a hard stop, and it says like, all right, yeah, you enjoyed that fruit, but I'm a serious wine, and this is not all about fruit. Like, I'm still in the Northern Rhone. This is still Northern Rhone Syrah. So I guess what I'm saying is there's a upfront, quality to it that you might not necessarily immediately go to the Northern Rhone on, like, initially, but it finishes very, very Northern Rhone. I just think that it's got their, I think that I almost think, honestly, like there's something like the initial attack. This has it has a little bit in a good way. It has a little bit of a California kind of Saxum Cinquenan type, like, like it's the fruit's there, but then it's like I said, hard stop. This is Northern Rhone. It finishes. It's got the leather. I actually get more black pepper than you do. This is actually pretty, I would say, prominent by any stretch, but to your point, because some Northern Rhones can be very prominent cracked black pepper. But I think it's there. To me, this is like the best of both worlds. This is the best of, Corby has a little bit of a reputation of just, in a good way, pulling the appellation that was once a little bit rustic, pulling it a little bit into, 2023, into the modern era, but not at the expense of compromising the wine. So it's still got a soul to it, but this is, like I said, in the same way that the Gigal almost has that sexiness that you want to keep going back and drinking it. This wine is going to be excellent for many years to come, but this is a great wine. It's showing beautifully now as we taste it. I think it's really, really nice.
Yeah. So I won't read his whole quote, but Jeb Dunnock says, it's remarkably elegant yet powerful.
Yeah.
I think that's it's up to the finest Cornas ever made. Bravo. Yeah, elegant and powerful. I think that too, certainly sums it up.
But I think, that speaks to, because it almost obviously sounds counterintuitive, but it's true. I think that there's a seriousness to the wine, but it shows you something. It shows you a portion of itself, but it's got that power that makes you think that many, many good years are still to come. For sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So hopefully a good introduction to some of you to Cornas if you haven't had
Yeah.
it before.
Yeah.
Look
Very,
for
very, very underrated appellation.
Yeah.
A wine that, you know, even by, I mean, like I said before, even by the Northern Rhone standard, I mean, Northern Rhone, generally speaking, by the world standards, is still a very affordable, you know, at its upper tier, you know, appellation. Cornas especially. You know, we've offered this wine in some more current vintages, and to be able to, you know, get really stunning expressions of this one from 17, 18, and 19 for, you know, well under $100. I mean, you know, well under $100. It just speaks to, understandably, I mean, Hermitage and Côte Rôtie get their due because those are spectacular wines. But there's some really, really great winemakers from Cornas and Saint-Joseph that are making wines. And to your point, you alluded to it. There's soils and there's so much of the best plots in Cornas, the best spots in Saint-Joseph that mirror everything that you're looking across the river at into Hermitage. You know, the soils are very similar. This, you know, much the same way. So, you know, the baby Hermitage is very apropos for certain wines. It's not all, but certain wines of the best wines of Cornas and the best wines of Saint-Joseph.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I hate to burst the bubble, but I think 100 points has actually pushed this wine slightly above $100 a bottle.
Is for this one, yes, that is true. On the on this particular wine, yes, you're absolutely right. But you know, it's nice to see that other really nice, you know, vintages that don't have quite as much age on them. Yeah,
absolutely. And Gerard just mentioned Saint-Joseph, which is another interesting appellation. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but the southern part of Saint-Joseph, which basically borders way down by Hermitage, is where the very finest of the wines of Saint-Joseph come from. Sadly, unfortunately, the authorities in France some years back, and many years back now, decided that Saint-Joseph could expand. And if you look on a map now of the Northern Rhone, Saint-Joseph runs from basically across the river in Hermitage all the way up to just south of Côte Rôtie.
Yeah,
and
it's wild.
There are some wines that coming out of the Saint-Joseph appellation, particularly in the north, that really should be avoided. I can't name names because I don't know them personally. I haven't bothered to try them, but the wines in the southern portion of Saint-Joseph, where when we've been able to offer Saint-Joseph, we know that's where the wines we've sourced them from, and that's where to look for Saint-Joseph, which is another very good value in Northern Rhone wines.
Yeah. Well, I will transition us into another spectacular wine, and again, the 15s. I mean, the widely considered to be, along with the 2010 vintage, you know, one of the truly great, and this is, you know, not hyperbole, one of the greatest vintages of, you know, realistically of the modern era. And Marcel Guigal has said that 2015 is the greatest vintage of his lifetime. So, you know, 50 plus years of making wine and being around wine, and obviously being born into a winemaking family. 15 is a special vintage. 15 is a vintage that is certainly built for the long haul. You know, obviously 9 and 10 are outstanding years. 19 is excellent as well. I mean, there's some great vintages in the Northern Rhone, but this vintage is a special one. So, you know, to be able to taste 200 pointers from this vintage in the Northern Rhone is great. So, like I said, transitioning to Delas and kind of capping the night here. I'm going to speak very quickly about Delas and the vineyard, which again I spoke about before, which was Les Bassards, the most granite laden of all the vineyards in Hermitage, very close to the river. And then I'm going to have Olivia play a quick 2-minute video to really give us some perspective on what makes Delas unique, what makes Hermitage unique, gives us a feel for the Rhone itself. So Delas was founded in 1835 by Philippe Delas, and much like Jabelet has been one of the larger negociants, so they make quite a bit of wine across the Rhone. You'll see Delas have an imprint in the Northern Rhone and the Southern Rhone, but they're also blessed to own some spectacular single vineyard plots that are responsible for some of the world's greatest Syrah, Les Bassards being one of them. And again, Bussard is the westernmost portion of that red section there of the hill. All of that leads up to the river right there is pure granite. That is 100% Syrah. That is pure granite. That is muscle. That is power. That is Syrah at its very best and very, very long-lived Syrah. And again, while Chave and Chapoutier are big proponents for blending across the appellation, and again, it's a small appellation, so even blending across the appellation, there's quite a bit of diversity in that little red section, which is Hermitage. There's quite a bit of diversity in soils and everything, but all things considered, you're blending across a fairly small appellation. The Delas Les Bussards is, as the name indicates, essentially a Ludi, a single vineyard wine from Bussard right there on the river in pure granite. So the current winemaker, Jacques Rhone, has been with Delas since 1997 and actually studied under Michel Chapoutier for 4 or 5 years in the early 90s. Apprenticed under Chapoutier and learned a lot and knows the Northern Rhone exceptionally well, and it's reflected in all the wines he makes. So with that said, Olivia, if you have the video that you could throw up, that would be awesome. While that's loading, Delas is currently owned by the Champagne House Roederer, so Louis Roederer. And Roederer has really, really elevated the quality since taking ownership of Delas. It's actually, a good example of having some corporate ownership that has really, really improved and improved the quality. Roederer, under the Roederer umbrella, you also have big names like Pichon de Lande in Bordeaux, Domaine Haut in Provence, and fairly recently, Diamond Creek in Napa Valley. So everybody thinks that, when you have these larger companies, larger parent companies, it's not always a good thing. The investments they're able to make and the high standards for quality across the board. I mean, you think Delas and, like I said, Pichon de Lande and Domaine Haut and Diamond Creek. I mean, those are, leaving, Domaine Haut, Provence aside, great wine for Provence for sure. But just talking about Pichon, Diamond Creek, and Delas, you're talking about 3 big names in the wine world for sure.
We may have some technical issues.
It's all right. No luck on a beautiful video that was going to take us on a little flyover of the Rhone. It would have just given us some perspective on everything. It really would have kind of put a bow on everything that we spoke about tonight. Obviously it's nice to, there's something to be said for seeing it on a map. There's something to be said for seeing it as a little bit more of an educational session like we've got today. But obviously there's nothing short of experiencing it, short of putting, boots on the ground in the Rhone. That would have been a nice opportunity to kind of see just what makes this such a special portion. We saw some pictures about how steep those vineyards are and what makes the individual vineyards so unique, but that's all right that we don't have it. We'll taste the wine here in a second. So much like Javelet is enjoying a great run of success with some current vintages. From about 2009 to the present, Delas, this Les Bussards, has been on fire. The 9 and the 10 were back-to-back 100-pointers, and it's joined by the 15 today, which is also a 100-pointer. Not surprisingly, you're talking about one of the single, again, Chave has always said that even though his Hermitage is a blended Hermitage, he's always said that the main component, you can't make a good Hermitage without Bussard as a backbone. Jeb Dunnick has said that he feels that Bussard is the single greatest terroir on earth for Syrah. And it's a special wine from a great vintage. And, you just, even smelling the wine and tasting the wine, you just know this is a serious one. And again, kind of, in much the same way that there was that juxtaposition of the 16 Rostang that said, my best days are ahead. Pigalle said, I'm great now. My best days might be ahead too. I'm really nice now. That's kind of how it is here. The Corbus, at least to me, is offering a lot, and it's a great wine. As we're having this tasting now, this Delas is pure power. Like, I just think this wine, this is to me, of all the wines, actually, I think, and this is, again, air quotes, the most mature of them, being the 15. I think this is the wine that is a surefire, put this down for a little bit longer, and it's going to be spectacular in due time. I think this is, I mean, if you can taste pedigree, like you just know this wine is going to be great in time. Young, powerful, muscular, tannic for sure, even being a 15. Yeah, nice. But if there's wines I'm drinking tonight and tomorrow, give me Corbus, give me the Gigal, even the Chapoutier for that matter. But if I'm the long-term play, something I want in my cellar for down the road, give me this wine. This wine's going to be incredible down the road.
I'm glad we saved this one to the last.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
It's been fascinating to go through this flight of both obviously Hermitage, Côte-Rôtie, Cornas, and now back to Hermitage. And this is thanks, Steve. Thank you. Safe travels. This wine has everything. I mean, it is absolutely stunning, I think. On the nose, on the palate, there's this richness, this roundness, this fullness, with absolutely no indication of any rough edges or I mean, it's just, I get carried away with the wine like this. This
is one of those wines that I think just kind of exemplifies why the Northern Rhone is so special. Why this is, I mean, the birthplace of Syrah, and why all the world's best Syrahs are measured against the Northern Rhone.
It'll be interesting at the end of the year when I change the footer at my emails and I put down my favorite wines of the year. Right now, this is going to be in that list.
It's really good. Really good.
Super. Yeah.
Olivia, are we allowed to bring you back in for a quick second to talk about your favorite wine? Can we do that?
I suppose so. I suppose we could do that.
What do you think? What was there's no right or wrong. What was your favorite? What were your favorites? Feel free to loop in another one. I mean, I think this was a great tasting, but even within 6 wines, in 6 wines, 3 vintages, a lot of different styles. A lot.
I think my favorite, honestly, was the 2017 Chapoutier.
Yeah.
And when Simon said it had a florality to it, I completely agreed. The second I smelled it, I got that, and I really love that. I'm a big fan of the Delos, or the Delos, I should say. And I do love the Rostang.
Yeah.
It is very tannic, but you can tell that it's going to age so well, and it's so interesting. Yeah, I think my favorite, the Chapoutier.
I'm right there with you, honestly. I mean, again, certainly no right or wrong. I mean, there's just the wines were just all stylistically. I mean, you can tell they're Syrah from the Northern Rhone, but the Chapoutier was, and I mentioned it at the very beginning, was just, to me, the Chapoutier aromatically was the most interesting of the bunch, and it transferred right to the palate. I thought it was a really, really nice wine. That was a showstopper.
I'm going back to the Chapoutier now. Yeah.
I already finished mine.
Yeah.
Good for you.
Interestingly enough, the of all my glasses, I tried to ration myself and obviously focus on the presentation. But of all the 6 glasses that I've got poured out, the Gigal was the one that and not necessarily because I think it's the best. I mean, I love the Gigal, but point being is that's the wine that's gone, and I think where I'm going with that is that was the wine that that's just a great really enjoyable, like keep going back and back and back and back. There's just like that approachability and that just sexiness about the Gigal that was, it's going to be a great wine in time, but damn it, if that glass isn't whole sample is not empty now,
Yeah. So as you can see, Olivia's posted up a poll. If you can chip in and place your vote. We can't, because not quite sure why, because we have no influence in the winemaking. Yes, we sell the wine, which, by the way, we will send out an email probably tomorrow, at the latest on Monday, with an offer on, I think, hopefully all of these wines. So some of them may be in very short supply, but we will send out an offer to you only, exclusive to those of you who were here tonight to join us, or those of you who are recording it and watching it later. And I think, well, let's see if the poll works. Can
you guys see the poll? I can see the poll. It's interesting. So
we
had an tie between the Delas, and the Chapoutier, and then the Delas it has inched forward. It has. I think it's going to be the winner tonight.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's a very nice wine. They're all very nice.
Yeah, I can't see that poll, but that's okay. Well, I think with that in mind, I want to say thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. It's such a pleasure to be able to share such fine wines with you, and to share our passion for these wines as well. I know that both Gerard and I love the wines from the Northern Rhone.
Yeah.
So for us to be able to experience these and to share our thoughts on them was something that we enjoyed doing very much indeed. Gerard, I'll leave you to have the final sign off, and we wish everybody a good evening, and keep in touch. Gerard, over to you.
Yeah, we really do. I mean, we value everybody. Everybody's so important to us, and these Zooms don't exist without the support of everybody on the other side. We get a chance to interact with everybody, but we can't say thank you enough. I mean, the demand for this was once again very, very strong, and makes us excited about the next tasting, which I know we internally were talking about having one in about 6 weeks from now, so middle of April. So a little TBT, so a little teaser there. But this is one that on paper came together, and again, these wines aren't. This was more of a tasting by way of timing, in that to be able to put together a cohesive, coherent Northern Rhone tasting across 3 different vintages with 6 big name producers, irrespective of scores. I mean, obviously this is a great example of the wines living up to their press for sure, but this is just from an educational and academic perspective. This was super fun. And again, we can't these tastings don't exist without everybody on the other side of the screen. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. And like Simon said, we'll be in touch. Unfortunately, quantities are fairly light. There are a couple lines that we have a little bit of depth on, but we'll touch base with more specifics tomorrow. A couple of these will be in lighter quantities, but please rest assured that as a thank you for being a part of this, we'll make sure that you, as an attendee, has the first look before anybody else, because these are special wines. So thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. And Olivia, thank you for doing a great job with all the media. Thank you.
Hey, thanks. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you all.
Cheers.
Good night.